Hey everybody, John from JB Subtle Gaming here, and I want to do, first of all, a real quick correction on the single-player game of Scythe, the solo game that the video put up yesterday. And then I figured I just finished my first game of Scythe. It was a two-player game a little bit ago, so I figured after that we'll talk about my first impressions of the game. A full review is coming once I've played it enough to feel comfortable reviewing it. Now, as far as the correction for the solo game, whenever the AI opponent is taking their turn, in the movement phase, the top part of the card, and on my first turn in the example, I had them try to do all of the movement. Technically, the way it's supposed to work is you're supposed to go from left to right, and then whenever they do what is a valid movement, then that's it. You move on to the get stuff phase. You don't do all of the movements that they can possibly do. So that is a very important correction, so I wanted to make sure I got a video out saying, like, hey, that was messed up. So if you do try to play the game, make sure they only get one movement in that phase and then move on. Now to my first impressions of the game. Overall, I really enjoyed it, and it played better two-player than I expected that it would. A lot of games that aren't designed specifically for two players, in my opinion, don't play all that well two players. Obviously, some games do, and I was a little bit worried about this with two, but it worked pretty well. One of the reasons I think it works pretty well is that while combat can be a focus of the game, and especially I feel like if you get more players going, it'll probably be more of a focus, but you have to spend resources to be successful in combat. So when you move into a combat, you can only have up to 5 units, and actually that affects the number of cards you can play, but you don't, in a lot of games it's like, okay, I have this many units, plus I'm going to play this card to add a certain amount of power to the combat. Your units don't actually count as anything, so you can move in 3 units, but if you don't have any power to spend and don't have good cards to use, then, or no cards to use, then I mean you're not going to win. So just having units on the board isn't enough to be successful in combat. You can't do combat over and over and over again because you have to spend resources to do it. So it's pretty interesting, and that ties in with something else, with the popularity track, which I'll talk about in just a second. There are several things I really liked. I did like the encounter cards, how instead of just having a bunch of flavor text, each one of them has fantastic artwork, and the artwork kind of tells the story. The choices overall are pretty similar as to, you know, get something, pay something to get a little bit more, do something terrible to get a lot of something. And those are going to be similar on, it seems like, all the cards, but each card does kind of tell a unique story by having a picture rather than words, and, you know, saying about pictures and words and whatever. And it works pretty well. The artwork on those are great, the components and everything are great. Does the game live up to the hype? I mean, I can't speak to that for every individual person. That's going to vary. Some people were getting annoyed about how hyped this game was, but I can definitely say it's not a bad game, and I enjoyed it so far. But like I said, the full review is going to be coming. And I did want to mention the popularity track. I wasn't sure I was going to like that too much. Basically, as you do actions, you know, your popularity is going to be affected. One of the big things is when you basically force workers to retreat. You move into a territory where your opponent has workers, and if they don't have any combat units, those workers just have to flee back. Or if you win a combat there, then they have to flee back. And obviously they tell stories about how horrible you are, and you lose popularity. And it was really interesting because we only had 2 combats in our game, and they were in the final 3 turns of the game. I made a big push to try to end the game. My opponent had more production than me. I was worried they were going to run away with it if I let the game go on too long, and I had 2 stars I had to get out, so I made a big push in order to do that and win those combats. And it was interesting because at the end of the game, I had more territories, particularly because in the last combat I took the factory, which counted as 3 territories. And but at the same time, because I basically guaranteed I was going to be pushed down into the lower tier while my opponent was in the middle tier of popularity, they were getting more points for everything. So yeah, I had more stars out than they did. I had more territories, but it ended up being just a 2-point difference in the game, and a really close game because of that. So because I was a tyrant, you know, the game ended up being really tight, and it seemed to balance out, because getting 2 stars in win combat seems like, oh, that's great and kind of simple, and there's a faction that can get even more out. And at first it might seem overpowered, but at the same time they have to have the resources, not just the units out there, but the resources to continually win combats. And especially if they're workers, they're getting another negative effect. So it's pretty interesting. I feel like the mechanisms tie in pretty well. The things that happen, the things you get based on the actions you take. it all seems to work together pretty well, but that's only after one game. So overall, still really excited about Scythe. Looking forward to playing it a few more times so that I feel comfortable doing a review for it. And while I can't say if this game is going to live up to the great amount of hype that it had, it's been really enjoyable so far. I don't really see any glaring negatives yet, but I definitely need to play it more. And I really, like the artwork and really like that idea of, you can play however you want. And I know it was only a two-player game, but we did play very differently. Even the faction boards, as far as your player board and your faction, the board with the actions are all the same, but they're slightly different cost, and then benefits you get. That played into it more than I expected. If you were patriotic or engineering or whatever, I didn't expect that to be much of a major role, but I could see how it would have an effect. And on one token you might be like, well, maybe I really want to do a certain thing and this board is bad at that, but at the same time you can use an engineering action to make that cost less for the rest of the game, and your other stuff, even if you do it less, it all seemed to balance out pretty well, and I was really impressed with it so far. So we'll see if I continue to be impressed with it with more plays and more player counts. But thanks a lot for watching, and we'll talk to you again soon.